Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the class. This week, we're going to talk about society and, in specific, something we call about poverty. So, poverty is one area of topic within the society that we're going to deal with it today in the motion. So, let me just quickly show you the motion. The motion is this house would give cash to poor to reduce poverty. So what does it mean? As you can see from the picture, this means that, well, if you're poor, the government will give you cash. Now let's try to look into some of the definition of this motion. So what does it mean by give cash? Well, that is quite self-explanatory. It freely gives you the possession to have cash. The government will inject cash into your bank account or in your hands. Poor, these are people who live under the poverty line. So currently, in any government, if you're really, really poor, usually depends on how rich or poor the government is, but usually the government will provide you with some sort of help, which is called subsidies. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. It could be they can give them free education. If you're poor, they can give you extra food, for example. But what the motion is saying in today's debate is that, okay, we're going to stop giving them free food, but instead we're going to give them money to buy food themselves. So the motion calls for substituting, meaning that we switch these free food, free education, like all these subsidies, to giving them cash. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in the next slide in terms of the background. So, well, we see globally poverty is a big issue. A lot of people live under the poverty line. In fact, according to the World Bank, 9.2% of the people live under the poverty line, meaning that they don't have access to clean water, food, or even proper housing. Uh, and also, same according to the World Bank, 25% of the people in the world live less than $3 a day, and half of the people in the world live less than 5.5, they earn less than $5.5 per day. That's around like 30 Hong Kong dollars. And that's all you get for your whole family for one day. So you can see that poverty is real and people really struggle. And depending on how developed your government is, sometimes government do issue out poverty, do try to address the issue of poverty through what we call as subsidies. As you can see from the picture in the right, these are some of the examples that government can give you as poverty. If you're really, really poor and don't have food, the government can give you pasta, tomato sauce, rice, oats, so on and so forth. Now, these subsidies are all funded, meaning it's bought by the tax money, and it is there to give what people need. And usually it happens to be clean water, food, or shelter. But the other part of the problem is that the question rises is that is these kind of food that government is giving to poor people what people really need in the first place? Let's take an example. If government is giving rice as a part of subsidies, but if you're the farmer who farms rice, then would it be any use for that farmer who has plenty of rice but don't have enough, let's say, cooking oil? Then what they need to do is they need to get that rice, go to the market, and change it for cooking oil, for example. So that doesn't really make sense, right? So isn't it better to just give that farmer money that he needs? Okay, so were there any countries that decided to give cash to poor people instead of subsidies? And yes, the case study is India. In 2013 January, India decided to substitute their current poverty support system to direct cash transfer system. So as you can see from the picture before, they used to give out rice or wheat for a couple, for one person, they will give some sort of amount. They're scrapping that because they see so much corruption. People are not they don't really need this in the first place, but they're still getting it, for example. And they thought this was very inefficient. So they decided to just inject cash to people who really need. So instead of this, now you're turning into right, saying, okay, if you're poor, every month, government will give you some sort of salary for you to at least make sure that you eat and you also get the things you really need. Okay, there are obviously some great things and not great things according to this. So people who like this idea is, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, and the argument is that, but at least it addresses what people really need. Money can buy most of the things that we need, and each situation of a poor person is different. A person may, a poor household may need education the most, for example, then that money can be used to educate the children. In other cases, the poor household may need medication the most because there is a person who's really sick, for example. Now, because every situation is different, and if you give them the same things to them, regardless of what kind of situation they're in, then we don't see that it tackles the issue of poverty. It doesn't really give it a lot of help to people. It only wastes a lot of tax money. However, the other part that people disagree with this idea is that, well, if you start giving, if the government starts giving salary to the poor people, then we see a problem because people will stop working because now they don't need to work because money will be injected to them every month. It's going to also be very, very expensive because it requires even more tax money to do so, and therefore this is not a good idea. So you can see that there are really good ideas against it, but really the core value that we see in today's debate is okay, we see the problem of poverty, meaning we see people who are poor. So this is a problem. And how do we solve this issue? Should we solve this issue by giving cash to the people who are poor? Or should we not give cash, but instead give them like food, education, and whatnot? Now so what do you think about this? Let's move on to the argumentation. If you're in a pro side today, you're going to say, let's give cash to poor people to reduce poverty. Because the value here is that you want to make sure that it is government's core responsibility to tackle poverty, to solve poverty. We want to make sure that no one is hungry. We want to make sure everyone is happy. That is the core value of government. And in order to do this, giving cash to poor people is the best way to resolve poverty. And that's what I want to hear from the government side today. The first argument is that giving money to the poor is the fairest way of eliminating poverty. What do I mean by this? Let's go back to the example of rice, right? And you can see that not all people need rice. And if you give poor people who don't need rice extra rice, what kind of problem are you trying to solve in terms of poverty? Actually, none. There are also other examples in the reading. The reading suggests in Indonesia, they decided to subsidize fuel, like because a lot of people go around by motorcycles or cars, so they decided to subsidize fuel. And what they really saw was that people who don't need subsidies on fuel benefit from it, like more like not so poor people, because if you have a motorcycle to begin with, you're not really poor, but the government decided to subsidize fuel using millions of tax dollars, and the people who really need it, who don't even have a motorcycle, did not get anything out of it. So it's not really fair in the first place by government deciding, oh, I think poor people need this, so we're going to give them. It's not really the best way to resolve poverty. The second argument is that it will also help to identify the poverty population. Right now, how does subsidies work? Well, if you take India, for example, then let's say they want to subsidize some rice. Okay, I'm using rice as example a lot, but anyway, let's use example as rice, right? Then the government will send some rice to probably a town, and then they will say, okay, everyone come line up. You can take the rice. One person will take 2 cups, for example, right? Well, if you think about that, then a couple of problems. What if people who are poor but who don't need rice, they're not going to show up, right? So you're not going to be able to see who really needs the money or not, because only people who show up will be the people who really need it. And who are poor but don't need 2 cups of rice will not show up. That's why if you decide to give cash, and to be honest, everyone likes cash, right? Who would not reject cash? Then everyone will get it, and then the government will see, okay, these are the people who really need the money, and therefore we will be able to help them. Yeah, it gives the transparency to the government to identify, to know who really are the poor people that they should help. Also, in the reading, it talks about what kind of benefit it will have if the poor people will have their own bank account. A lot of people don't have money in their banks, but if you inject the money like a salary in their bank, they will also learn the idea of how to save money and how to manage their own money. So that's also a good thing. The third argument here is that if you give money directly to poor people, it is very efficient. Think about it. If you're, and again, I'm going to use rice as an example, sorry, but let's say you want to give rice to a town in India. Then what do you need? Well, you need people who needs to harvest the rice. Government needs to go and pay for the rice, and the government needs to hire drivers who can drive all these amount of rice to that place, and then need people who distribute it. That's going to take a long time. That's going to also waste a lot of money on fuel, gas, and people. So it's not as efficient. It's going to take time. And when people need food right away, what is faster? Government buying that rice and giving to people versus government just giving money to the bank account. Providing money will take only seconds, but providing rice will take days or even weeks. And therefore, this is not this is a better and more efficient way to eliminate corruption. Lastly, you can also say providing money directly to the. So what I mean by the fourth argument is that when you usually if you're the poor people, just because you're poor, not everyone need rice or not everyone need oil, right? So if you give money directly to people, then it will give them the freedom to use the money to their most needy area. Who are sick will use it on the medication. Those who really care about the education of their children, they'll send the kids to school. Those who need water will buy the water. So it is actually better because it really works as people will have their freedom to choose whatever they need the most. Now let's look at the Consite argument. The Consite do agree that there is a problem with poverty and they want to really address this. But then the whole idea is that, look, okay, fine. Um, it is okay to give them material, but if you start giving them money, then it's going to bring a lot of people a moral hazard. What I mean is that they're not going to work too much because they'll take things for granted. Oh, the government is giving money, therefore I don't need to work. And therefore, you want to give a stance by saying giving cash directly to poor people will really not solve the idea of poverty, the problem of poverty. The first argument here is that if you give out money, it does not encourage people to take responsibility. Think about it. Most people will need to work hard and they need to be honest to earn money, right? So for many of the honest, hardworking people, they work every day to earn money. But if you are poor and you decide, it's like, wait a minute, I'm getting salary even if I don't work, then it really creates a moral hazard because people will say, okay, I'm not going to work anymore because now the government gives me more money, right? So it takes away the feeling of responsibility of people and people will stop working hard and it will just prolong. People will say, why do I need to work? Because government will pay me anyway. There's no need for me to work really hard. So that's the beginning of a big problem. The second argument here is that money cannot be targeted to meet specific needs. So for example, like what people really need if they're poor is that they need healthcare. What people really need are sometimes education. And if you just give them money, sometimes people might not be able to know what is good for them. And therefore, this is not going to be the best way because you cannot really target just money by and say, oh, okay, I gave the money and therefore you don't need to be poor anymore. Um, so the government cannot just use this and say, okay, okay, I gave money, so there you go, my responsibility is done. You're on your own. Where the truth is that it is really the responsibility of government to build a system that can help people to get them out of poverty by giving them quality education, by giving them counseling, meaning that you teach them what is the right thing to do. Just giving money cannot really target like the people who are poor, yeah, because it is not going to automatically mean that they will send the kids to school. They will not know about it. So it's really the education from the government that needs to educate the people out of poverty. The third argument here is that it is wrong to assume that individual knows best. See, it is quite similar to the second argument, but second argument is really the idea is that government, instead of just throwing money to people, they need to give them what they need the most. And the third argument is that it's more on the poor people side. Just don't assume just because a person don't assume that a person knows everything. If you give money to poor people, sometimes they might use it for what they think it is best, but in reality, people might use it for drugs, people might use it for alcohol, or people will just use to shop their stuff. And what they really need to do is they need to learn about saving money. They need to learn about how to send their kids to school. But usually, if you're poor, then people are not educated well enough. So they just use it on like meaningless things. Like, okay, maybe I should buy an iPad, for example. So it is wrong to assume that the government will always know that people are smart enough to buy things what they really, really need for their future. Lastly, of course, if you start giving money, it's going to be a burden to our taxpayer because number one, you cannot reduce the quality of public education. And also, if you start giving a income, meaning a salary from the government to all these poor people, you actually need more money. Studies show that you need, U.S. alone, you need more than like $3 trillion. In this case, what we see is that well, it's going to increase tax for honest working people. They need to pay more tax money, and therefore, this is not fair. Where the government can use this money to create more parks and library, now they need to give it to the poor people as a salary, and that's not right. And therefore, this is not a good idea. So these are all the arguments I can think of in both pro and con side. But really, you're free to come up with your own ideas, and it's really about if we think about what is best for the poor people, should we just give them cash or should we not? And that's going to be really the idea of today's debate. All right, so that's all my arguments. Hope you can come research. Then until then, I'll see you in the debate class. Thank you. Bye bye.